For the past 3 centuries, the political power in the United Kingdom has shifted from the monarch to the Prime Minister, with both positive and negative results, which have changed the face of Britain and the world for years to come. Today I'm going to rank them from worst to best, spanning from Robert Walpole all the way up to the infamous Margaret Thatcher. In this video I will not be including the living Prime Ministers, as not only are they all still living, but their premierships are too recent to give a fair ranking. Even if I did rank Liz Truss, she wouldn't be able to make it onto the list with how short her term was. And finally, just to note, I may switch up how I refer to the Prime Ministers, between their titles and their actual names. Now to begin with the Prime Ministers who are barely Prime Minister at all. George Canning was the shortest serving Prime Minister until Liz Truss resigned in 2022. His short term prevents him from being ranked on this list, as he only served a total of 119 days as Prime Minister. His premiership was marked with difficulties to form a government. He fell ill following the funeral of the Duke of York and died of tuberculosis later that year. This is a bit of a predictable ranking, but honestly, you can't get worse than Anthony Eden. His premiership was just a huge disaster, and the irony is that Eden had been waiting in Churchill's shadow for years, waiting to succeed him as Prime Minister, just to completely fall flat on his face. Immediately after becoming Prime Minister, Eden called for a general election in which he increased the Conservative majority. He was extremely popular when he became Prime Minister, which shows how badly his term went. And the colony of Sudan also gained independence during his term in 1956. Of course, there's the elephant in the room, the Suez Canal crisis. Despite being close friends with Dwight D. Eisenhower, the US did not support their invasion of Egypt. The coalition of Britain, France and Israel militarily defeated Egypt, but Egypt controlled the Suez Canal. This was an embarrassment for Britain worldwide and prompted Eden's resignation in 1957, although it was officially due to ill health. An absolute embarrassment of a Prime Minister who managed to make a mockery of the British Empire in less than 2 years. Despite only serving just a little longer than his predecessor, Goderich managed to be extremely controversial as Prime Minister. He had high expectations from both the King and Parliament and let everyone down. This was due to both his weak leadership and having to care for his mentally ill wife. His weak leadership annoyed the King so much that the King felt that he practically had to do the Prime Minister's job for him. He resigned the next year due to the stresses of office, simply a weak politician who clearly couldn't handle the office of Prime Minister. Well, what can I say about Spencer Compton? Very little, to be honest. He served as First Lord of the Treasury for just over a year, and the Leader of the Opposition, Lord Carteret, led the House of Commons, leaving him virtually powerless. He's remembered for being a poor leader and having died in office in 1743. Sorry Spencer, but you're just forgettable.
This was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sung this strain.
Augustus Fitzroy, also known as the Duke of Grafton, did next to nothing as Prime Minister. His government was divided and it failed to prevent the French from annexing Corsica. These reasons led to his resignation in 1770. Just really forgettable. Oh my, David Lloyd George, the final Liberal Prime Minister who also served during the end of World War I and during the Irish War of Independence. He was also the only Welsh Prime Minister of Britain. English was the second language, with Welsh being his native tongue. Lloyd George became Prime Minister when H.H. Asquith resigned in 1916, as he was held accountable for the British losses in World War I. The new coalition had a Conservative majority, but the Liberal Lloyd George remained Prime Minister. This was because many Liberals joined the opposition with Asquith. He centralised his power during the war and implemented rationing in Britain to support the war effort. The war remained a stalemate until August 1918, when the war turned in their favour and was won in November. In 1919, Lloyd George was an important figure in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which harshly punished Germany and would instill German anger which would erupt in World War II. However, that same year the Irish War of Independence broke out. In response to attacks from the IRA, Winston Churchill recruited World War I veterans to form the Black and Tans, which would terrorise the Irish countryside, fighting the IRA but murdering many civilians. Lloyd George called a truce and negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which partitioned Ireland between North and South. This established the Irish Free State, which would remain a British dominion with the King as head of state. This led to a civil war breaking out in Ireland. Lloyd George was unable to effectively handle the cost of living crisis in Britain in the post-war years, and unemployment levels rose. When he got caught up in a scandal over the sale of honours, the Conservatives ended the coalition, forcing him to resign. In short, I believe that Lloyd George deserves to be regarded as a war criminal for his actions during the Irish War of Independence, and is already considered one of the November criminals for his participation in the Treaty of Versailles. He also alienated the working class, his main base of support, which ended the Liberal Party. While I do recognise his diplomatic skills, his negotiating in the Paris Peace Conference would eventually lead to World War II, and his Anglo-Irish Treaty would lead to the Irish Civil War. He caused misery both at home and abroad, which is why he's so low on this list.
Nations not so blessed as thee must in their turns to tyrants fall.
Here we go, the most controversial ranking on this list. Probably more controversial than where I'll put Churchill. Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister after defeating James Callaghan in the election of 1979 due to the Winter of Discontent. She restricted powers of the trade unions, which put a halt to nationwide strikes following the Winter of Discontent. She also privatised state-owned companies. She proved to be very polarising in Northern Ireland after her heartless response to the hunger strikes led by Bobby Sands in 1981. Her handling of the strikes led to Sands' death and an escalation of violence. She even survived an IRA assassination attempt. However, she couldn't prevent the outbreak of a recession and high unemployment. Had it not been for Britain's victory in the Falklands War against Argentina, then she would have lost the 1983 election. Thatcher deregulated the UK financial markets in 1986, leading to an economic boom known as the Big Bang. Thanks to this, she won a third term in 1987. She became even more controversial for her support of the poll tax and her Eurosceptic views. She resigned in 1990 following a challenge to her Conservative leadership, and she was succeeded by John Major. I believe that while she certainly gained a reputation as being the Iron Lady, I don't think it was for a good reason. She was an aggressive Prime Minister who was unable to compromise and shared Lloyd George's coldness in terms of Ireland, despite being part Irish herself. I mean, even the Queen supposedly didn't really like Thatcher either. So there you go.
Must in their turns to tyrants fall. While thou shalt flourish great and free, the great eternity of them all.
Dear oh dear, what an eventful term. Upon becoming Prime Minister, George Grenville attempted to arrest John Wilkes, the man who caused the resignation of Lord Bute by publishing satire in his newspapers. However, Grenville had to halt his pursuit of Wilkes in order to deal with Britain's enormous debt due to the 7 Years' War. Not only were taxes in the American colonies raised, but Grenville's government passed the Quartering Acts of 1765 and the Stamp Acts. These caused riots all throughout the colonies. It was also during his term that Britain became politically isolated, as they had no powerful allies in mainland Europe, especially not Spain or France, who had competed with them for their colonies. He was ultimately dismissed by the king in favour of Lord Rockingham. In short, he was a talented politician who simply could not manage the colonies. James Callaghan was the only Prime Minister ever to hold the offices of Chancellor, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary before becoming Prime Minister. That means he was extremely qualified and was a great Prime Minister, right? Callaghan inherited a country crippled by high inflation and led a minority Labour government in the Commons. One of his successes was in education, in which a national curriculum would be introduced 10 years later thanks to Callaghan's concerns of education. In 1978, Callaghan had managed to reduce inflation by holding pay rises. When this proved effective, he tried to do it again to secure a victory in the 1979 general election. Trade unions across the country thought he had gone too far and went on strike in the winter of 1978 to 1979. This became known as the Winter of Discontent. His popularity plummeted when he claimed that there was no mounting chaos building up in Britain, which made it seem like he had no idea what was going on. He lost the vote of no confidence by one single vote and was forced to call a general election, in which he was defeated by Margaret Thatcher. He would be the last Labour Prime Minister until Tony Blair took office in 1997. 18 years later, Callaghan was just a huge disappointment. He even admitted to himself that he let the country down. John Stewart, also known as Lord Bute, had become Prime Minister as he was the royal favourite of King George III. Bute was the first non-English Prime Minister of Britain, being from Scotland. He had previously been appointed as the King's tutor following the death of Frederick, the Prince of Wales, in 1751, and had become a family friend. Bute was not only the first Scottish Prime Minister of Britain, but also the first Tory Prime Minister, ending over 40 years of Whig dominance. His government had negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War. However, to fund the reparations for the 7 Years' War, he introduced the first high taxes on the American colonies, which would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Bute would then resign after being satirised by the media, and he fell out of favour with the king, but remained friendly with the Dowager Princess of Wales. Ah yes, the Prime Minister who lost the colonies. Initially, Lord North was extremely popular for bringing about a breath of fresh air to British politics. He was the first Tory Prime Minister since the Earl of Bute, and he actually got along well with the King, unlike many of his Whig predecessors. His government had a notable victory in their first year of power, in forcing the French and Spanish to back down in the Falklands crisis of 1770. This managed to drive a wedge between the Franco-Spanish alliance. However, in 1773, the Boston Tea Party occurred in the American colonies, resulting in the passing of the Coercive Acts, known as the Intolerable Acts in the United States. By 1775, the American Revolutionary Wars had officially broken out, and in 1776, the US Declaration of Independence was signed. During the war, North delegated much of his decisions to his cabinet members, such as Lord Sandwich and Lord George Germain. Due to Britain's period of isolationism, they were left with no allies during this war, and so the French, Spanish and Dutch allied themselves with the United States against Britain, hugely contributing to their loss. Back home, North's government imposed laws which prevented Catholics from serving in the military. This led to the Gordon riots of 1780 in London, but these were quelled as many Londoners were anti-Catholic at the time. North was forced to resign after being defeated in a vote of no confidence. This vote was brought about following the British loss at the Battle of Yorktown, which practically lost Britain the war. If you want someone to blame for Britain's embarrassing loss against the Yankees, you can blame Lord North. Edward Heath, more commonly known as Ted Heath, succeeded Harold Wilson as Prime Minister in 1970 and is mainly remembered nowadays for being a major screw-up of a Prime Minister. I'll start with the positives. Heath reformed the local government, which reduced the amount of local authorities. He also managed to get Britain to join the European Communities, the present-day European Union, in 1973. This membership would prove to be a popular move in the country, and the membership would last until 2020 under the premiership of Boris Johnson. Now his negatives. Heath had to deal with the Northern Ireland troubles and approved the policy of internment without trial. He also suspended the Stormont Parliament and imposed direct British rule which would last from 1972 all the way until 1998 for the majority of the Troubles. The unsuccessful Sunningdale Agreement was signed in 1973 by Heath. In terms of his domestic policy, he tried to reform trade unionism by passing the Industrial Relations Act of 1971. However, in 1974, British miners went on strike and cut the country's energy supply until their demands were met, leaving the country temporarily without electricity. Heath called a general election to resolve the crisis, but lost to Harold Wilson. Despite his few positives, his negatives heavily outweighed them. Poor Lord Rosebery, the man who really didn't want to be Prime Minister. He was only chosen as Gladstone's successor because Queen Victoria didn't trust any of the other, more left-leaning Liberals. Rosebery really only controlled the House of Lords, with the Commons controlled by his Liberal rival, William Harcourt. He could not successfully pursue his foreign policy because of the split in the Liberals. Rosebery lost what he considered to be a vote of no confidence in 1895 and resigned. In all honesty, he really didn't want to be Prime Minister, especially with having to deal with the split in the Liberal Party. And to be honest, I don't blame him. Neville Chamberlain, more like Neville Longbottom if you ask me. He was the Prime Minister who couldn't stop World War II from breaking out because of his failed appeasement policy towards Hitler. I'll get the positives out of the way first. His domestic policy, for the most part, was inoffensive. He passed another Factory Act, which protected the rights of the workers. However, his foreign policy is what he's most remembered for. Firstly, he ended the Anglo-Irish Trade War in 1938 and surrendered the so-called treaty ports to the Irish, which Winston Churchill criticised as it would leave Britain prone to attack. Of course, Chamberlain also implemented his policy of appeasement, which was a soft policy which would only give Nazi Germany a political slap on the wrist every time they take new territories, such as the Anschluss and the Sudetenland. This couldn't prevent the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the beginning of World War II. When Norway was conquered by the Germans, his conduct of the war was put into question. His majority of the coalition was reduced following a vote of no confidence and he resigned. I can't help but feel pity for him, but that pity won't save him from this poor ranking. Prime Minister with the most unfortunate name ever. Bonar is another one of those forgettable Prime Ministers, as he had the shortest term of any Prime Minister of the 20th century. He was of both Scottish and Irish ancestry, but was born in Canada. There's not much to talk about his premiership in all honesty. The partition of Ireland officially came into effect during his term, but he previously contributed little to the cause. Britain was in financial debt to the US and had agreed to repay £25 million per annum. However, the inexperienced Chancellor, Stanley Baldwin, promised them £40 million per annum without consulting the Prime Minister or his cabinet. This proved to be extremely embarrassing for the Prime Minister, who considered resigning. In 1923 he contracted throat cancer and could not physically speak in Parliament. He resigned and died later that same year. He was succeeded by Baldwin, the Chancellor, who nearly made him resign. Simply a weak Prime Minister. The Duke of Portland was another rather forgettable Prime Minister who was easily controlled by other politicians. In his first short-lived government, he was the head of the Fox North coalition, but held no power. Under this coalition, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was signed, but upon Fox's attempts to reform the East India Company, King George III threatened Parliament that if anyone voted in favour of these reforms, that they would be considered his personal enemy. This was due to the King's hatred of not only Fox but the coalition itself. He then dismissed the coalition and replaced Portland with William Pitt the Younger. Portland became Prime Minister again 24 years later and served as a figurehead of a divided government again, this time over a new generation of politicians such as George Canning and Lord Castlereagh. Due to Portland's poor health, He resigned in 1809, dying shortly after. Fairly useless Prime Minister in my opinion. What is there to say about the Earl of Derby? The most interesting thing about him are those mutton chops. Like honestly, what's going on there? Derby formed 3 separate governments, all 3 making a total of only about 3 years in power. Due to the split in the Conservative Party with the breakaway Peelites, Derby had to appoint many inexperienced politicians to his minority government. When the list of ministers were read aloud, the deaf Duke of Wellington kept shouting, "Who? Who?" giving the ministry the nickname of the Who government. This government proved to be a failure, as he could not effectively govern while in the minority, despite having the future Prime Minister Disraeli on his cabinet. He lost a vote of no confidence after trying to pass a budget. His second government was notable for finalising the transfer of India into the Crown's control. It was during this term that the Whigs and the Peelites merged to form the new Liberal Party. Derby's government fell after only a year in power. Derby's third and final government saw the passage of the Reform Act of 1867, another Factory Act, and the Master and Servant Act. He resigned in 1868 on his doctor's advice. In short, he was an ineffective Prime Minister who accomplished next to nothing in his many governments. Oh, Balfour. I mean, he wasn't a total failure of a Prime Minister, but nothing to write home about either. He was the nephew of Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, his predecessor. Balfour left much of his foreign policy to Lord Lansdowne, preferring to focus on domestic policy himself. He passed the Land Purchase Act of 1903, which effectively bought out Anglo-Irish landowners, giving more rights to Irish farmers. In 1904 he secured the Entente Cordiale, an alliance with France which King Edward VII contributed to a great deal as well. However, after abandoning free trade, many in his cabinet resigned, leading to his own resignation. Not the worst Prime Minister, but could have been a lot better. Robert Peel is remembered nowadays as being the first Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. His first government was formed at the end of 1834, following a series of successive governments. In January 1835, he issued the Tamworth Manifesto, which formed the basis of the newly founded Conservative Party. His first government was defeated in a vote of no confidence, and he resigned in 1835. Upon his return to power, Peel made many new changes. He passed the Factory Act of 1844, which introduced safety standards in factories, such as setting safety standards of machinery and limiting the working hours of women and children in the factory. Yes, children. However, despite these positives, Peel's government had many negatives, which include his controversial repealing of the Corn Laws, which upset just about everyone in the country. Peel also reacted to the Great Irish Famine very poorly, intentionally giving a poor reaction due to his belief that reports of the famine were exaggerated. In my opinion, his handling of the famine was unforgivable, despite his Progressive Factory Act. John Russell became Prime Minister following Robert Peel's resignation over the Corn Laws. However, Russell's Whigs were still in the majority in the House of Commons until the general election of 1847. Russell's domestic policy was rather progressive for his time, including the Factories Act of 1847, which further restricted the working hours of women and children above the age of 13 in factories. He also introduced teachers' pensions and the Public Baths and Washhouses Acts of 1847 and 1848. He also tried to pass the Jewish Relief Bill Act, previously blocked by the Duke of Wellington, which wouldn't be passed until 1858. However, his response to the Great Famine in Ireland was nearly as bad as that of Peel's. He initially tried to administer the Irish people to both workhouses and soup kitchens, but when he realised this wasn't working, he passed the Poor Law Extension Act of 1847, which left the responsibility of the famine in the hands of the Irish landlords, thus making the famine no longer Britain's problem. Russell also bravely attempted to recommence the UK's relationship with the Catholic Church. However, this proved to be unpopular with the Protestant population and pretty much failed. His government would fall because of Russell's disagreements with his Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Palmerston constantly embarrassed his government by sympathising with the revolutionaries of 1848. In 1851 he recognised Napoleon III's coup d'etat without the permission of either the Queen or the government. He was then dismissed, causing him to cast a vote of no confidence while out of office. This vote brought down Russell's government. He would once again become Prime Minister in 1865 as a Liberal, but this divided government would only last until 1866 when he resigned. His low ranking is mainly due to his poor response to the Great Famine in Ireland, but I sympathise with his struggles against Lord Palmerston. William Cavendish, the Duke of Devonshire, only accepted George II's invitation to become Prime Minister on the condition that his term end at the end of the parliamentary session. His short-lived government shared power with William Pitt the Elder, who practically ran the government. Cavendish managed to raise funds for the war, sent troops to the colonies, and passed the Militia Act. The King dismissed Cavendish over the execution of John Byng, and he was succeeded by his predecessor, the Duke of Newcastle. Also, Cavendish is the 5 times great-grandfather of King Charles III. It's a small world, I guess. Spencer Perceval's government wasn't expected to last that long, however it lasted just under 3 years. Perceval wasn't the first choice to replace the Duke of Portland, but with both Lord Grey and Lord Grenville refusing to form a government, Perceval became both Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer. As Chancellor, he was skillful in managing the country's funds, such as being able to fund Wellington's Iberian campaign. In 1810, King George III fell into his final and permanent mental illness. This provoked another constitutional crisis, the same as in 1788. George, the Prince of Wales, was threatened to become Prince Regent again, and due to a preference for the Whigs and a dislike for Perceval, it was assumed he would dismiss the Prime Minister. However, upon the passing of the Regency Bill in 1811, the Prince Regent didn't dismiss Perceval. This was mainly due to Lord Grey and Lord Grenville once again refusing to form a government. Perceval was assassinated in 1812 due to the depression and the censoring of the press during his tenure. He would have been better off remaining as Chancellor. The last Prime Minister to take office while sitting in the House of Lords, which he resigned from not long after, in order to join the Commons to serve as Prime Minister. Alec Douglas Hume succeeded Harold Macmillan in 1963. In fairness to him, he inherited Macmillan's failing government following the Profumo affair. He was seen as an out-of-touch aristocrat who was stiff and awkward during television interviews.
In 3 short years of his presidency, he left an indelible mark on his country and on the world. And for us in Britain, his loss is a deep and a sad one, because he was the most loyal and faithful of allies.
During his term, President Kennedy was assassinated, and once again Anglo-American relations soured, this time under President Johnson. In terms of domestic policy, Hume passed the Resale Prices Bill, which abolished the resale price maintenance. By the time the election came around, people were surprised that Hume's government didn't entirely collapse, but this couldn't save him from a Labour victory. Lord Aberdeen is remembered for being the Prime Minister during the Crimean War. He is also the only Prime Minister to have served while being a member of the breakaway Peelite Party. Aberdeen's government was made up of a coalition between the Whigs and the Peelites. However, he made the mistake of keeping on both Russell and Palmerston, as they would constantly clash during the course of his government. This wasn't helped by Aberdeen's poor leadership. His weak and divided coalition government would be brought down by the Crimean War. Aberdeen himself was more pro-Russian in spite of the French, but was forced by his government to declare war on Russia, fighting alongside the French under Napoleon III. The war had become unpopular in Britain by 1855, and an inquiry was proposed into the incompetence of Aberdeen's government in terms of their handling of the war. Aberdeen resigned the following day, In my opinion, Aberdeen's government was just too divided to properly control, with the Crimean War being the cherry on top in terms of his government's failures. Ramsay MacDonald is best remembered as being the very first Labour Prime Minister, thanks to the virtual fall of the Liberal Party following Lloyd George's premiership. MacDonald's first premiership was short, just like Baldwin's first. MacDonald held both the role of Prime Minister and of Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which he was talented at. His main aim as Prime Minister was to reconcile with Germany after the Treaty of Versailles ruined the relationship. He convinced the French to end their occupation of the Ruhr. He also recognised the USSR in this term, which began the issue of the Bolshevik threat. A general election was called, and MacDonald lost due to anti-communist sentiment and the supposed Zinoviev letter, which may have been a forgery. MacDonald returned in 1929 to form a minority government. His second term would focus more on domestic matters rather than foreign affairs. He would make attempts to clear slums nationwide and tackle unemployment, but in 1929 the Great Depression began with the Wall Street crash. MacDonald's government had no real plan in case of an economic crisis, which led to a huge increase in unemployment. The situation became so dire that government ministers such as Oswald Mosley resigned. Mosley would later found his own party and convert to fascism.
We live in a period.
MacDonald attempted to resign in 1931, but the King convinced him to form a national government coalition with the Conservatives and the Liberals. Upon doing so, the Prime Minister was expelled from the Labour Party, now belonging to the National Labour Party. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed, which gave Dominions in the Commonwealth the freedom to make their own laws. The Irish, under Eamon de Valera, immediately used this to begin cutting their ties to the Commonwealth. However, MacDonald's final national government was frustrating, as he was treated as a figurehead thanks to the Chancellor, Neville Chamberlain, and the Lord President, Stanley Baldwin. He resigned in 1935 due to his failing health. I believe that MacDonald's government had so much potential, but were incredibly unlucky with the timing of the Great Depression and the split in the Labour Party. And that's the end of part 1. Now I know I put up a poll and 75% of you wanted to see a mega video, but I do have a valid reason for splitting it in two. I mean, look at this. What is this like? This has become a nightmare to manage after about 15 Prime Ministers, and it would just be impossible to continue like this. So anyways, enjoy the second half of the ranking, and I'll see you next time.